would like to do now is, before we introduce all of our esteemed panelists who are present here in Washington, which is -1, Ambassador Sedgwick is going to join us shortly. What I would like to do is turn your attention first to the monitor over here, where we are truly privileged to have Ambassador John Shattuck join us from Budapest. What better place than directly from a European capital to hear the views. Ambassador Shattuck cannot stay for very long, so with the permission of our esteemed panelists, before I introduce them, I would like to give the floor and the opening to Ambassador Shattuck. I've told all the panelists what we would like, basically, is to cover three main issues today. Number one, what's the bottom line assessment of the European perspective? Are they appalled or amused by this election? Number two, do they recognize any contribution from Europe? Brexit, anti-immigration feeling, rise of the right. Do they recognize any commonalities or even contribution onto our politics? And third, of course, are the implications for transatlantic relations and, of course, relations with Russia and so forth. Ambassador Shattuck, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and I'm sorry to be here in such a remote fashion, but nice to accommodate me in this way, and I appreciate the opportunity to briefly comment on the U.S. election. I should say, in fairness of full disclosure, that only several days ago did I come from the U.S. to Budapest, here for a conference, and had engagement with quite a number of Europeans, obviously including Hungarians. I was also in Berlin yesterday, so I have some atmospheric information to supply, as well as perspective of Americans who follow the election extremely closely in the United States. I would say several things about European reactions to this election. First of all, I think there's a sense of, to a certain extent, of common themes that are being raised in Europe and the United States. Not so much policy themes as themes related to the underlying unrest in the electorate, and particularly concerns about both the economy and certainly about security and identity, which are very broad, to be sure. And I think the second thing that's probably even more important is that I think Europeans, by and large, speaking with, are quite surprised at the extremely low level of stability and lack of real respect for political discourse that seems to be manifest in the United States, particularly in the case of the Republican candidate Donald Trump, in the way in which he has been portraying both his opponents and many others in the United States who he is seen to have significantly insulted. So we have, I think, quite a tumultuous environment in which this election is being conducted, and it's not unlike some of the tumult that we've seen in Brexit, to be sure, in the UK, some of the rise of some of the nationalist and nativist, populist, mostly far-right parties in other parts of Europe. And then we also see, right here in Hungary, the appeal of what is called by the Hungarian Prime Minister illiberal governance or illiberal democracy. So there are some common themes in the U.S., but I would say above all, the lack of stability and the real dangers that political discourse and democracy so badly debate as a result of the way in which this campaign has been conducted, that there's a real concern among Europeans, as there is obviously among Americans as well. So that's an overview, if you will.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shattuck. I should have mentioned Ambassador Shattuck in addition to his diplomatic appointments, is President Emeritus of Central European University there in Budapest. Now, it is also my pleasure to introduce our panelists here in Washington. And Ambassador Shattuck, please stay with us as long as you can. I'm going to introduce them in an order that you see them from left to right, but that says nothing about any political spectrum here. It's really random. And each, of course, we will be speaking as did Ambassador Shattuck with their impressions of Europe, and each brings a distinct perspective from a certain nationality. We're trying to have a representative in that way. So, with a British perspective, we have Dr. Amos Gelb, who is founding director of the Washington Media Institute. Thank you, Dr. Gelb. Next to him is Ambassador Andras, former ambassador of Hungary to the United States and managing director of the SAIS Center for Transatlantic Relations. Then, seated next to him is Martina Buttler, who's here with German radio. Martina, welcome. Seated next to her is Lenka Kabrhelova, if I pronounced it. Kabrhelova. Lenka is here, your chief of Czech radio. We'll also be giving this perspective on Russia, the Russian dimension as well as the Czech dimension. Next to her is Ambassador Eacho. Bill was ambassador to Austria under President Obama, and recently was back over in Vienna. Seated next to Bill is Dr. Federiga Bindi, professor at University of Rome and also a fellow at SAIS Center for Transatlantic Relations. And we have some of the Italian perspective. For a French perspective, we're very pleased to have David Cadier, who is a popular fellow, transatlantic postdoctoral fellow, and also at the Center for Transatlantic Relations. We're here to be in the room. And just joining us, just in time, perfect timing, we have Ambassador Sedgwick, who was ambassador to Slovakia under President Obama, and who also happens to be a member of the board of Eacho, the Institute of Global Affairs. So, folks, welcome. You heard my three basic questions. The bottom line, the comparison and the connection to what's happening in Europe, whether there's a contribution, and finally, the implications. To get us started, I just thought I would read to you some short excerpts from a piece that the well-known Washington Post columnist E.J. Young wrote back in May, in which he talked about how the import of from Europe and the influence on Europe on our election. And this is what he wrote. Trumpism is not an American religion. Almost every plank in the candidate's vaguely defined platform is derivative of the European far right. It is gaining ground on the basis of opposition to immigration, fears of terrorism and crime, economic nationalism, and promises of a government wielding a muscular hand against the forces of discord. And he goes on to say Trump's emergence is a symptom of a larger democratic distemper roiling the world's political parties on the center right and center left that have underwritten free governments since 1945. So I just give you that. There's a respected here in Washington poll saying there directly is impact and influence from Europe on this highly unusual election process. And for now, I offer up to our panelists who would like to begin. Bill, would you like to get us started? Sure. Just a moment in Europe.
Happy to. Is this working? Okay. I think it's hard to say whether the European experience with its far-right parties and their resurgence is really impacting on our situation, but there's no question that there are parallels. And frankly, you see these parallels all over the world because this experience of nationalism and fear of the foreigner, fear of the unknown, the election democratically of more nationalistic, autocratic, strongman type candidates We've seen it with Duterte in the Philippines. We saw this rejection in the UK with Brexit. And we see the resurgence of, the extreme right in countries in Europe. As you heard, I was just in Vienna for a couple of weeks, and in Austria they're going through an unusual situation where they have a runoff election now for the second scheduled time, a runoff between an extreme right candidate and extreme left candidate. The center right and center left candidates both lost in the first round for the presidency. Now, the Austrian perspective is more that, well, yes, but it's not quite like in the US. Your situation's far more, concerning because, of course, our president is more of a symbolic job, and we can live with whoever is elected. Now, that's what some say. Others, of course, over there are quite concerned about what's going to happen. That said, there's tremendous concern about our election and tremendous interest. Part of it is, as Ambassador Shattuck mentioned, this concept that, well, our discourse has become far less civil, and they're shocked at what they read and what they see. Part of it is simply, from a policy perspective, concern about some of the change to American foreign policy that Mr. Trump has proposed. So there's no question that there's tremendous concern. There's a fear factor, a fear that, gee, maybe the U.S. won't have our back anymore if Mr. Trump is elected, particularly vis-a-vis Russia's relationship with Europe and the Austrian relationship with Russia. Austria has always been a neutral country, and we can come back to this, but there's a lot of concern that, well, gee, if Trump's elected, that could be a new day in American foreign policy. The Trump perspective on nuclear weapons, the Austrians are aghast at that, of course, and they're very anti-nuke there. And the idea that he would encourage other countries to develop their own nuclear capabilities and not rely on ours, that certainly is of great concern. So it's both there's a policy aspect to their concern about Trump. There's a reaction to this lack of civility, but there's tremendous interest in what's happening here. There's no question.
Who would like to follow up? Would be shy. Todd, could you
Ambassador Parro, thank you for your hospitality. I don't want to take time away from the Europeans themselves who would have a good perspective, but I'm interested in some journalists to draw the connections between Russia and the right-wing parties in Europe and the right-wing parties in the United States. And I think there are a lot more connections than maybe meet the eye. For example, Neil Farage came over and campaigned for Trump. Trump was over and has very close connections to the Brexit movement, supported it, advocated for it in the UK, and is very close to Wilders, for example. And he says that there's no Russian money behind him, but the only element of the Republican platform that was changed was the part about Ukraine. And they softened their position on Ukraine in the Republican platform because Manafort was the campaign manager at that time. He was fired. But now Trump himself says he's not getting any money from Russia, but his son said that they had, and he's not willing to release his tax return. So that raises a lot of questions. But the only other thing I'd say, apart from these Russian right-wing connections, is that I think in talking to Europeans, they're really kind of horrified about the money going into politics in the United States. When I was ambassador in Slovakia, I was asked to give thoughts about ethics in Congress and what we do in the United States with respect to ethics. And I talked to a number of, brought experts in and talked to members of parliament there. And it was really going well until the question was asked, well, what about Citizens United? And then I had a hard time to rebut the among Europeans that the money in politics in the United States is out of control. And so that's a big issue that I think the that the Europeans are concerned. And of course, it's a big problem in many countries. But, and of course, I think that if the Europeans are tired of this long campaign season, the Americans are really tired of it. And we can't wait to get it over with. And the Europeans are perplexed about the whole system that some president can be elected, even though they have the minority of the votes, because it's very hard to explain the electoral college system. So those are some of, and then, but I think that Secretary Clinton, by and large, most Europeans divide along typical lines where the ones who are pro-EU, they like Secretary Clinton because she is very solid with the EU. She knows the European leaders, whereas the people who are behind Wilders and the right-wing parties are obviously more, I'm not saying anything that's not obvious, but they're more favorable to Trump. So I want to yield my time to the Europeans.
Okay, do we have a European perspective? Yes.
Okay, so as you can see, I don't take it personally that as a Brit, I'm put at the very far end. And then the ambassador here very generously asked me to move even further away.
That was funny. Come on.
It's your line.
It was fun.
So let me, a very esteemed crowd, so let me give a bit more of a plebeian view. Britain is the home of the raving loony party, right? We've had cranks and crackpots for years, and it's a lot of fun. And at the moment, we're kind of self-absorbed with our own. Nationally, we did what our football team does every World Cup, which is we find ways to spectacularly self-destruct. And so right now with Brexit, we're very much concerned, not really with the election. The average person is more worried about, oh my God, we actually did this thing, and the economy's going to hell, and Wales is going to lose our whole steel plant, and Theresa May has come in, and my God, if anybody remember our old great prime minister, we now have a great prime minister, a woman who is, as far as anybody can tell right now, is dashing with all great speed towards mediocrity and sort of anonymity, aside from undoing everything Cameron's done. So what is the view? The view is sort of a mixture, and the British humor is like, wow, this is kind of funny, right? This guy's kind of funny. And wouldn't it be amusing if he won? And it's like, could he really? But I would say that the bigger and more important issues, I don't think, I would completely agree with the far more esteemed and sensible panel than myself. But I think that on the actual level, we're too consumed. It's young versus old. It's the major centres versus the old centres. We've got Scotland, who is trying to work out, can we actually go now? Right? So I think the election is Game of Thrones. You can watch it on HBO or CNN. Take your choice.
Yes. Well, first of all, Ed, I'm a little disappointed with the panel because we Hungarians are not used to having to share the stage with anyone else. That was funny. What's wrong with you? This was funny. That was a very good line, and I'm gonna be. Yeah, this was good. All right, and I'm totally with you. I think that's a very good line for the whole of Europe. I mean, it's exaggerated to think that the Europeans wake up with the American elections and then are worried day in, day out. But they're really worried about a couple of things. Well, first of all, I agree with you. It's kind of Game of Thrones. They think about Game of Thrones or maybe what's this other one with Kevin Spacey? House of Cards is a good preparation for this show. But in all seriousness, I think the Europeans are basically worried about, one, is the United States going to start showing true leadership for the family of Western nations? Two, is there an understanding that we're in it together? And three, I think the Europeans are a lot more worried about themselves, if they can be a seriously strong and good partner for the future president. That's a bigger worry in Europe, and I think that's the way, in a way, in many ways, the U.S. election is holding a mirror to the Europeans. So I think that's a bottom line. But I want to say one thing. This is a great opportunity and a great crowd to thank John Shattuck, Ambassador Shattuck, for the incredible service he's rendered to all of us in Europe, being president of the Central European University, and you and I go back much longer, but I just want to say, John, it's a pleasure to see you, and thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Andras, and I'm glad to be in your city.
There you go. Martina, Andras mentioned elections, and Germany is a country, along with France, that has important elections coming up. Would you care to share your perspective?
Which is why we have other worries as well. So I go along the same lines, but I would like to go lower than Game of Thrones, because the comparison that I've heard just about a week ago from Germans who visited was, it's like the Housewives of, you know, it's really low and it's trash TV, but you still have to watch it. So that's the perspective that you hear from Germany. It's like you see the amusement, you see that people are totally bewildered, because with any of the things that Trump said, where we have to be honest as journalists, we always thought, this is the nail in the coffin, he's not going to survive this. And yes, he does. And so we have to look very critical at ourselves in a certain way as well. But it's something with every single topic along the lines. A German politician could have just packed his bags and leave. It's something that Germans do not get. They do not understand, and they think they do understand the United States very well. But they do not understand how you can survive politically if you have examples like with the Khan family. If you go along the videos that just surfaced, you can go back and forth all the time with what he said about Mexicans and the way he phrased it. It's something that Germans don't understand, and especially because Germans do not understand why Hillary Clinton is not as wildly popular as they think she should be, because obviously there is a great sympathy in Germany. If you look at Bill Clinton, they remember, obviously, and there is a great alignment. So they're like, why doesn't she lead by like 20, 30, 40% by now? So there are things we have to explain, and obviously they're asking us as journalists, so why the hell in the US? And then we can just turn around and say, you know, guys, how about you look at your own country? Because things that happen in Germany right now and parties that are emerging are going right along the lines. If you look at AfD, which is a right-wing populist party that gained traction over the last 2 years during the with more migrants coming in from Syria, and they are actually praising Trump. They're saying, oh, he's refreshing, he's right along our lines. So they would be very happy to sit in a boat with him. And the last state elections we had, they won actually with the first time that they were on the ballot with more than 20%, which was quite scary for many people. And the question is, how long are they going to be in for it? But there are things that are obviously that have parallels to what's going on here. So whenever we're asked why is this happening in the U.S., we're kind of like saying, well, this is why it's happening in the U.S., but please also look at yourselves. And you can see that if you now look to politicians, that there is wide concern, because usually Germans tend to keep out of things. And for at least the first time that I can remember in U.S. politics, the foreign minister made a statement and called Trump someone who's preaching hate, which is new to German politics, that you would do that before someone is elected. So that tells you how big the concern is if you talk with politicians in Germany.
Thank you very much, Martina. Before we turn to Lenka, Federiga, and David to the interviews, let me just quickly follow up from Germany. You mentioned politicians, and you mentioned, I thought it was very interesting, that where there is some equality of the impact, the influence on Europe. How do you believe Chancellor Merkel sees now this question of the migration issue? The way it's been used here, of course, as maybe the most singular issue, we're using this as a clear line on migration. Is there, do you think, maybe on her part, acknowledgement that perhaps her policy, noble as it was a mistake? Would you see the regional elections? How, and now with the Trump factor maybe refracting back into Germany, how do you think she's processing this?
Well, I think we all know her well enough by now that we know she's not taking things like quickly and rushing through things. So she's waiting the elections out. That's what I think. She's waiting what's happening. And when you look at polls in Germany, just as recent as September, no one believes, or not no one, but the large majority doesn't believe that Trump will be elected. But if you look at her own policy, I mean, there was a strong push that people criticized her, and she lost elections over this. And they said, well, this is because you said everything's going to be easy. Well, you know, I mean, she's walked back a little, but only as in, what does that mean for our country? I think Germany has no way to retract from, to go back from the way that we welcome people. We have a certain history, and this is a personal statement, I have to admit that, but I think there is no way we could have acted any differently, given many arguments, but one of them that is very strong is our history. And so it is, I think, a given that we opened our doors. And to be honest, being abroad at that time, it's tough to usually say, because we don't do that as Germans, I'm proud to be German. But this was the one moment, sitting in Washington, D.C., seeing how my countrymen were welcoming refugees, was the one moment where I talked with my neighbors, American neighbors, and I said, this is the one moment where I'm proud, but I'm warning you, because they were enthused about what Germans did. And I said, wait a moment until reality kicks in. And reality obviously kicked in, because I think the problem was how she sold it. The problem was to say it's going to be easy, it's going to be quick, it's not going to be a burden. And that was a given that it would be a certain effort. But I think they're getting there now, and obviously it's going to be a huge topic in the elections that are coming up.
Thank you very much. Lenka, would you care to
Yes.
give us the view from Prague and more widely?
The view from Prague. It's interesting how much, thank you again for organizing that on the first place, and how much the view echoes what we hear from the other countries. So maybe Europe is united, at least in some point. I don't know if that's the happy part. Seen from the Czech Republic, when you mentioned the foreign minister, German foreign minister, we also have an endorsement. On the other side, Czech President Miloš Zeman was one of the few leaders who actually endorsed Donald Trump. He openly said that he agrees with his stances on immigration, with his stances on economy, with his stances on the fight against terrorism. And that very much says a lot about how the Czech society is split, basically, because the president, Miloš Zeman, is, of course, again, same situation as in Austria, for example. He's the representative leader. He should theoretically not set the foreign policy. So then there is government who didn't obviously endorse anyone. And the Czech society, I think it goes along the lines. I looked up some polls. I was surprised that there are some polls. So most of the Czechs are pro-Hillary Clinton. They would vote for Hillary Clinton, and only about 20% for Donald Trump, which again, according to the polls, sort of echoes the affinity of those people to vote for strongmen, to vote for authoritarians, and to endorse Russian President Vladimir Putin. So it's all in one pack. To also explain in what stage now the Czech society is, I think a lot of people do realize it, that we've had our sort of Trump moment years ago when the Czech president was elected. It was a very, for the first time, it was a public election. The people actually went to the polls because the president used to be elected by the parliament. And it was a big discussion in the society, and it was exactly split almost in the middle, and it still is going on and still reflects in the discussion, even on the American elections. One part of how people reflect the American elections, I think, is also the concern of what it will mean on the discussion about Russia, Europe and Russia. That's why I was supposed to talk about Russia. I used to be a correspondent in Russia before coming to the US. So the two perspectives, obviously, from here, it's seen the actions of Russia are seen a little bit different than when you're sitting inside Russia. But I think what Czechs are very much aware of is how the situation, even in their own country, is being shaped. So suddenly all these issues they thought were only fringe opinions are sort of endorsed by Donald Trump, and by how big those all talks about how Russia is going to be American friend and how that is going to reflect the whole ties with the NATO. I think that scares a lot of people in the Czech Republic.
Thank you very much. Federiga.
Hi. Well, first of all, congratulations for organizing a panel which is gender balanced. You know, you should get a kudo on that. And that means, and thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Ambassador. And well, coming from Italy, I see lots of comments making a parallel between Berlusconi and Trump, of course. And I would rather, first of all, I would like to say there is no comparison whatsoever. In the sense, the men have three things in common. They're both rich, they're both communication savvy, and they both like women. But it stops there. And because Berlusconi, you could like him or not like him, but he had ideas. He had very concrete ideas of what he wanted to do with the country. And this is not the same with Trump. And so if you have to do a comparison with the Italian political scene, then the comparison is rather with Movimento 5 Stelle, the five-star movement, that are xenophobic as well, nationalistic as well, but they don't really have ideas of how to rule the country should they eventually get the leadership. And you can well see in Rome, where the major was, it's from Movimento 5 Stelle, she was overwhelmingly elected, 70% in the second round. But she has no idea. So Rome is basically has been ungoverned for the last 2 months. The only thing she did was to reject the bid for the Olympic Games for 2020. So I think we have to learn a lesson from Italy is if you have no ideas about governing, you're going to get in trouble if you get there. The second lesson that you can get from Italy, looking at this election in Rome, but also from our previous elections, it's that certain people are voted in the secret of the booth, but people don't say it loud, even when they're polled. And this is the reason why I'm super nervous about November 11. And I got even more nervous when an Italian diplomat in town was like, oh, Hillary is totally going to win. I was like, now I am really worried. Because this is the perception you have in Italy. Hillary is totally going to win. This is going to be an easy ride. So nothing for granted until, we have to learn something from Italy, is nothing for granted until the vote is actually in there. That being said, the Democratic Party is totally pro-Hillary. Other parties are more nuanced, but very few come out and say loud that they would favor a Trump presidency. Also because when the first debate took place, everybody was an expert in American affairs, and the number of friends of mine who watched the debate live at 3 a.m. was astonishing. But now we have our own referendum taking place on December 4th. So in Italy, everybody's a constitutionalist right now, and the debate is rather focused on the referendum. And so the American elections went on the background a little bit, and of course our prime minister came over here, and was blessed by President Obama. But one of the things which came out of the last WikiLeaks was our foreign minister begging for meeting with Hillary, which I thought it was a little bit depressing. The way they begged her to meet with him, which she didn't, by the way, because, as I said, they think she is going to win. The last point I would like to raise is Europe. On the one side, I do think that the Trump presidency would be detrimental not only for Europe, but for the rest of for the whole world, because if we have a buffoon in power in a country like Italy, that doesn't really harm the world relationship. But if you have an inexperienced and undependable president in the US, this is going to be trouble for everybody. But that being said, for Europe itself, paradoxically, Trump would force the Europeans to wake up. Because with Hillary, the Europeans could continue to do business as usual, which also means being divided between each other. With Trump, they would be forced to wake up and unite. So paradoxically, that is the only benefit I see. But on the other side, the downplay. I mean, the flaws are so many that I wouldn't want to have that. But just to put this into the picture, I know this will baffle some, but I think we have to say that.
It's interesting to mention that those of you who remember the debate, this was a talking point on Donald Trump's.
Well, thank you, Edward, and thank you to our hosts and to the organizers. The funny thing is that when I saw the question how Europe sees the US election, I didn't take it as then you explain whether Trump is a European invention. My question was rather, will we get a European Trump soon or not? It was rather the other way around. Is it some kind of musical fashion that's going to take a couple of years to reach Europe, but then we're going to play some Trump tunes all around Europe as well? How long is it until we have a French Trump? Do we already have a French Trump? These kinds of questions. And again, the kind of idea that Trump is European invention, there was an interesting op-ed by Ivan Krastev in the New York Times a couple of days ago, saying that actually Trump is very unpopular in Europe. Why some European countries that do vote sometimes for world-building populists have such a negative view of Trump if it's a European invention?
Is there anything you'd like to share before you take off? Anything you
Well, I think the stakes in this election are very high. That's clearly coming out of the discussion. That's certainly the perspective that I'm getting from Europeans over here. I would just say that not only the stakes are high for Europe, high for the United States, they're high for democracy. I'm very troubled about the condition of democracy in both Europe and the United States, where not only the level of discourse, but the kind of statements that have been made relating to perhaps not accepting the results of the election, relating to janilling the other candidate, either obviously those statements made by Donald Trump. So that, I think, there's a very disturbing anti-democratic tone to what's going on in this election. That said, I think that the prospect that Hillary Clinton will be elected is quite high, and I think she will be very good. She will be very good for Europe. I think she'll steer back in a direction of engaging the United States with the European Union. But I think the long-term issues relating to the health of democracy are ones that both Europeans and Americans are going to have to really face up to, because we are in a time of considerable crisis for democratic values and the protection of minorities and protection of general institutions for democracy. That is a theme that I'm hearing here in Budapest. I heard it over the weekend in Berlin, and it's a theme that I think should be of concern to all of us. So thank you very much. I wish I could stay for the rest of the conference, but I have another engagement.
understand? Ambassador Czech, quickly as you go, just because Hungary has been such a source of concern here in terms of democracy. How about Orban? How about his followers? Are they publicly supporting Trump? How does that whole phenomenon play with Orban and his followers?
Well, I'm not hearing among people that I'm interacting with here in Budapest much support for Trump. I know that Orban and some other members of his government, no doubt, have publicly voiced support for Trump, which I think is perhaps not surprising, since some of the same themes that Trump has been raising are themes that have been raised here in Hungary. But I haven't, in this particular visit, I haven't been here long enough to make any further assessment of that. I think for the moment the Orban government seems to be fairly firmly ensconced in Hungary.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sharakusunem. Thanks so much, and wish you all the best.
Thank you very much.
David, we come back to, as they say on the debates, we pivot
Yeah.
to David, we're going to pivot, and we're going to pivot right back to the point you were making about Ivan Krastev, those who don't know, very astute Bulgarian who writes a column in the International New York Times. Just on this point, you were making a point that Ivan said that actually, surprisingly, Trump is not terribly popular. Please continue.
Yeah, it's actually very unpopular in Europe. And again, the puzzle is, at the same time, Europeans do vote for populist, anti-immigrant, world-building politicians. So why is that? Actually, there was also a very interesting poll by the Pew Research Center where they polled different European countries, and the question was, do you have a positive attitude of Barack Obama, Angela Merkel, Hillary Clinton, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump. And so the links are quite interesting. In every European country, Donald Trump is less popular than Vladimir Putin, except in one country, Poland, right? Which we can actually understand historical reasons, but also traditionally Poland has been supporting Republican candidates. But what's interesting is which country stands where. And if I come back to my country, France, actually France is with Sweden, Netherlands, and Germany, and having very high rates for, at the same time, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Angela Merkel, right? Then which are the countries where Trump has the highest number of supporters? In that order, Italy, Hungary, Poland, and then the UK. So the question is, how do you explain that? Is there a link, for example, between support for Trump and support for Putin? Is there a link between support for Trump and having populists in your own government? And there's no direct link because, for example, of course, Hungary and Poland, you can say that they have some populist-leaning government. I'm not a diplomat, so I guess I don't have to be too diplomatic. That's the advantage. But Italy doesn't, right? And still, Trump is very popular in Italy. And the link with Putin, Putin is the most popular in Greece, which is also the country where Trump is the least popular in Europe, for some reason. Or Germany, Putin quite popular, Trump very unpopular. Or as I said, the opposite, Trump quite popular in Poland and Putin very unpopular in Poland. If I come back to France, so just to say that there is no clear explanation of why countries support Trump or not, but interestingly, there is a common consensus of rejecting Trump by Europeans. Is there such a thing as a French Trump right now? How will the Trump phenomenon play in the French elections? I mean, obviously, the first thing we need to bear in mind when we look at U.S. election through French eyes is we have to bear in mind how much Barack Obama is a rock star in France, right? I mean, this is really probably the most popular U.S. president we had, although I was a bit young in JFK's times, I don't really remember how it was, but he's very, very popular. And I'm almost expecting that some in France were secretly hoping that the birth certificate thing was true so that we can then prove that he's actually French, right? but in the end, it didn't happen. And arriving here, I was quite surprised to see that Americans seemed to be actually claiming Barack Obama as their president as well. So it was quite an interesting to do. In France, obviously, the old designated culprit in terms of French Trump would be Marine Le Pen, right? Patriotic discourse, anti-immigrant. And she actually literally said that she would vote for Trump. And the support for Trump is highest among the FN supporters in France. 29% of the FN voters have a positive view of Trump, while 26% have a negative view. But again, 29% is still not too much, right, of having a positive view on FN supporters. The one thing I would say, though, there is a major difference in terms of communication strategy. Right now, Le Pen is keeping a low profile. And it's actually very surprising that Le Pen has been much less outrageous and immoderate than Trump lately. Because the tactic of the FN right now is what we call dédiabolisation in French. It would be de-demonization. Not sure whether it works in English, but so she lets the other being agitated and she keeps a low profile. And who gets agitated? Someone who actually, I would argue, is the most Trumpesque in a way right now, at least in his political strategy, Nicolas Sarkozy. Yeah, apparently the audience is actually aware of his recent declarations. And my point about Sarkozy is that there are some commonalities in terms of topic, zero tolerance against delinquents and terrorists, amalgamations, simplifications, and so on. But what I find very interesting is the communication strategy. Sarkozy exaggerates first to grab media attention and to force his political opponents to position themselves towards him and towards those topics. Again, it might be reminiscent of what Trump has been doing. And I would actually argue that both have demonstrated quite a remarkable agility in terms of coordinating their past deeds and current words, right? They have a certain latitude, I think, in being able to say one thing and exactly the opposite and then say that they didn't say that. So this would be, I think, a commonality. And to conclude, back to Krastev's piece, he was saying he was giving two explanations of why Trump is not popular in Europe. The first is what he called the pilot plane hypothesis, right? It was referring to people that would be happy to drive drunk, even some of their friends, but would be really appalled when the pilot plane actually had a sip of beer. because it's much more important when you crash a plane than when you crash a car. And the US is a plane, other countries would be just small cars. The second point, he actually says that Trump's anti-globalization discourse doesn't really hold in Europe, because we see globalization, some people in Europe see globalization as actually Americanization. So this kind of new discourse of globalization being detrimental to the US is actually something that doesn't hold in parts of Europe, because they actually see globalization as being very much driven by financiers from New York, like Mr. Trump, right? So this is why this doesn't hold. But my final and third point is that I would add a third explanation, is that this shows that populism is actually not an ideology that voters adhere to. It's actually more of a political strategy driven by politicians that build on reactions from voters. That's why you don't support populists abroad, because you vote for populists in reaction in your own country. You vote against something, against someone, but there is no populist of the word unite, no international populism, I would say, a tendency, and this is why I think it's less of an ideology than a political strategy. And happy to also to, maybe just one word finally on the diplomatic side, because I discussed how France, and especially the public, sees the elections, but diplomats are trying to anticipate the outcome of the elections. Why would a change of administration mean for transatlantic relations and for French foreign policy objectives? It's impossible to work with the Trump hypothesis. I mean, it's very difficult to predict. So if we work with the Clinton hypothesis, rather, I think there's an expectation that she would be more of an Atlantist, at least in the sense of striking personal relations with many European leaders. But also there is a consciousness that after such a divisive election, she'll have to focus on domestic issues, on healing wounds, on tempering some of the economic, racial tensions that have been popping up, and so on and so on. So she will also be less available, I think, for Europeans. So again, a bit like under Obama, the link will be more transactional, working with certain countries on certain issues. And for France, that would probably mean counterterrorism, Near East, Middle East, and Africa, and so on and so on.
Thank you. Follow up
Yeah.
very briefly while you have the lecture, and then we go back to everyone here, and to our audience. You mentioned about how populism is at home, abroad, but of course in Europe there was tremendous transnational support for populists in Greece, for example, warmly welcomed in Spain and elsewhere. So we did see it did translate. Then the most surprising statistic you relate, I think that Costa was Poland, because even though they traditionally go for Republicans, Trump has been so anti-NATO and so fawning of Putin and Russia, and Poland is nothing if not anxious about Russia. That's its traditional orientation, and that's why traditionally it's so. That is very strange. Greece is more easily explained because of Greece's affinity with Russia, Orthodox connection of some explanation. But quickly, I would like to ask you bottom line. Does Trump help Le Pen in the sense that he, the way you're describing it, looks sort of out of character? She's reacting in a low-key way, and does she now look like a more reasonable than Sarkozy? So does Trump being so outlandish, Sarkozy reacting in his way, all of a sudden make Le Pen look like a reasonable alternative?
Well, actually, precisely because Trump is so unpopular, I don't they avoid making reference actually to him. And Sarkozy said he would vote for Clinton, which was also quite impressive in terms of not being too prudent in case he becomes president and Trump becomes president. It might cause some problems. But again, I think the Trump factor for French politicians is much more going to be about a communication strategy than actual content on topics, because in a way, many political parties in France didn't wait on Mr. Trump to be anti-globalization, right? I mean, it's almost stealing thunder that has been pushed forward in France for some time. Will the Trump phenomenon affect the results of French elections? I don't really think so. I mean, except if he's elected, it's again difficult to predict. But domestic issues will really be a key. And again, a bit like in the US, it's going to be about who you vote against rather than who you vote for.
Thank you very much. Now, Andras, please, and then we will.
I want to make a very, very brief comment. First, I want to say that the Europeans hate American leadership, but they hate the lack of it even more. And I think that could be the way the Europeans look at this election. Well, let me come back to something that John Shattuck said. He talked about democracy, the backsliding of democracy. Now let me narrow it down to this parochial Hungarian approach. There are two kinds of Hungarians. There is the Viktor Orban, who openly praised, was hoping for Trump. He said, I hope Trump wins. It will be much better for Europe, for me, for blah, blah, blah. I think what members of his party say and his followers say doesn't matter, because they always say whatever he says. If he turns around, they will turn around. But that's not the issue. There is an other half of Hungary. It's about 50-50, which cares about the U.S. elections, because there is an expectation that the next U.S. government will come back and look at Central Europe as the unfinished transition from dictatorship to democracy, and that the United States, the President of the United States, will at least spend a little time trying to figure out how we can get Central European countries back on track towards democracy and stop the backsliding of democracy, stop corruption, which is destroying Central and Eastern European societies. So I think there is a huge expectation in Central and Eastern Europe, and I don't think they look at the elections in the United States as something funny at all. They look at it very seriously, but this is the bottom line. Will the United States care about democracy in other countries, and first and foremost for them in Central and Eastern Europe, and for Hungarians in Hungary?
Bill, did you want to follow up quickly? And then this gentleman has a question, and then I think Bob Button will want to share some perspectives on domestic U.S.
I just wanted to go further on this issue vis-a-vis the relationship between Europe and Russia, because there was one Austrian made a very interesting comment to me. I asked him, what would you think? And he's a reasonably well-known conservative there. What would you think if Trump were elected? What would be the perspective here? And Austria is a neutral country officially, and very proud of the fact that by adopting neutrality, they were able to get the Russians to voluntarily leave after World War II. So they really try to keep a friendly face towards everybody. But he said, I think you would see a shift back towards cozying up to Putin, because of the feeling that, well, we can't count on the United States anymore to have our back. So we better be really friendly to Putin and hope that he doesn't decide to get aggressive towards, or more aggressive towards Europe. In other words, relax the sanctions, that sort of thing. Let's be really nice to Putin because we can't count on the U.S., which to me was really interesting and a bit surprising. Not when you understand the Austrian psyche a little bit, perhaps. I don't know, Peter, I don't know. You know it as well as I do, but see what you think. But it's shocking in a way. That said, I think the overwhelming population in Austria, with the exception perhaps of the far right, are very supportive to the Clinton campaign in this one. And of course, they're all, similar to France, very fond of President Obama. So they'd like to see, they'll feel reassured with a continuation, the sense that Clinton will be more of a continuation of the Obama presidency.
That attitude towards Putin not only is surprising, but it's scary.
Yeah.
This gentleman has a question. Please identify yourself.
Yes, I'm Niklas Helwig from the Center for Transatlantic Relations as well. I'm a transatlantic fellow there. Thank you very much for the interesting insights, especially on the obvious point of the Trump factor in this election. But I would be also more interested in this aspects that you mentioned, and so David mentioned, of the potential and now more likely President Hillary Clinton and the effects on transatlantic relations. So there's this kind of perception, of course, that there will be changes in the foreign policy in comparison to the current Obama administration when we look at her position towards Russia, but also maybe a more interventionist stance on
the question in Syria. So yeah, my question would be, how is that perceived in the different countries? Is there an expectation that maybe there will be more expectations put on Europe, for example, on the role that Germany plays in Ukraine? Are there views on the potential Clinton presidency? Thanks.
Very, very interesting question. Martina, is Germany, and Federiga, while perhaps knowing Hillary Clinton very well, also perceive that there will be some shifts on foreign policy? What might be the expectation?
I think it goes along the lines, I'm going back to my British colleague who said, well, not that we are consumed with Brexit and all those things right now. There are so many things going on in Europe right now that are first and foremost, I think, on their plate right now, where they're like, how are we going to survive as a European Union? How are we going to keep together this organization, which was so important not only economically, but also for peace in Europe. So I guess that's right now something that is very much on the forefront. And of course, then, if you talk to German politicians, there are enough who've worked for a long time on TTIP. And they are hoping that all this years and years of negotiations weren't for nothing in the end. So those things obviously are things that Germans listen to very closely. And talking about Putin, of course, watching closely how this is playing along and how this is going to probably change and affect Germany. But I think the one thing that you can actually see is that people are really waiting it out. And I think the disbelief is right now so big in Germany that you would see a President Trump, that there is nothing like, at least not in the, if you look to most Germans, as in the majority of Germans, that they are concerned with foreign policy changes because they just don't see a President Trump. They may be surprised. They may be waking up on November 9th and be surprised. But I think it's something that they don't believe that's going to happen right now. But if you look at our foreign minister, for example, who said Trump is someone who's giving hate speeches, he is very concerned, and you can see it, because he said it is very dangerous in this world that's becoming more and more complex to have someone, he didn't use the words, but I would summarize it as a loose cannon, someone who's not as stable as Germans would expect a counterpart in the U.S., because obviously for Germans, the U.S. is always the first partner we're looking to if we're looking to foreign policy, if we're looking for kind of like where is the world moving, we were always strong allies, and for Germany, the U.S. is so important that major shifts here would be something that are immensely affecting German foreign policy. But I think you will see, at least with the current chancellor, that they will start moving thought-wise after November 8th.
Yeah, one of the facts you mentioned Brexit, but one of the expectations I have on Hillary Clinton in terms of transatlantic relations is that she would try to convince Prime Minister May to go back on Brexit. She said there is no way back, but until when they call for Article 50, this is no way back. And if you look at the number of people near to Clinton in foreign policy which have advocated on the fact that Brexit should not take place. So I expect her at least to try that, because from an American perspective, Brexit is at least as bad as in European terms, if not more. And so this is number one. Second, it's TTIP. She is against it now, but I expect her to change her stance on it as soon as she goes back in powers, to go back to her previous position, with some nuances, but she will support it. And here the problem would be rather on the European side, especially if you look what is happening with CETA, what is up with Wallonie and the Canada, and it's so. But I expect her to go back on that. Russia, it's more nuanced, and the whole, there are two things which remain a question mark. The whole narrative against Russia was somehow fueled 2 years ago by people around the Clinton campaign, when they were preparing to run against Barack Obama, all right? Because the real turning point there was when Joe Biden said he would not run. This is when Hillary's stance on domestic politics and foreign policy dramatically changed. Because remember, what Biden said is that in his speech, which is clearly was a speech prepared to get into the campaign, was at the end of the campaign was like, oh, I'm not running, but don't you ever dare to run against us. This is when Clinton and Sanders changed their policy. But in the year before, there was a sort of a preparation of running against Barack Obama's foreign policy in order to say that if she had been the commander-in-chief, she would have been more hawkish. So that remained into the political discourse. And the part of that which we never talk about it is Libya. Libya was a huge mistake, which was, I'm afraid to say, pushed by Hillary Clinton. I was in the administration there at the time, and I saw it, what the American administration did to push countries in Libya. So this hasn't come back, but you know, it tells us a little bit of what is to come forward.
Thank you. I was in Kosovo when the land pension was Sarkozy and Cameron. Exactly.
Yes, it was Sarkozy and Cameron, and the American administration got really mad. Ivo Daalder shampooed his American colleague at NATO. He was furious. But then, at a certain point, it was decided that, I mean, look at the speeches. There are speeches where Hillary says that Libya is the best example of transatlantic relations. She gave a speech at Brooklyn saying that. You know, it is the worst example of transatlantic relations, but it was put forward as a good example of transatlantic relations because the dirty job was done by the Europeans, not by the Americans.
Andras, if you could share Amos.
So this is, I would think from the British perspective, it's more a case of let's see what happens, hard or soft Brexit. If it's a soft Brexit, then Britain's back in part of the EU, sort of. You know, my kids get to go and work in all your countries quite happily. Otherwise, what was the point? If it's a soft Brexit, then it's sort of status quo, and Hillary's a known quantity. If it's a hard Brexit, if it comes out hard, then I think you're going to see a very interesting. Then it becomes a question of what is that relationship? Because the British have always, you know, two peoples divided by a common language, as Churchill once said. But there's always been this affinity, and I wouldn't be surprised if Britain turned west, right, at that point, and hoped that Hillary would become point. But again, all of this, as my colleagues here have said, we got to see what's that. We're so navel gazing at this point that questions, what are they going to think about Hillary? We got our own problems. She'll be there when we work out how we've messed up and what we've got to do.
Very quickly to Nikla's question. The question is what different can be done on, let's say, Syria and Ukraine, right? And I would say that from the French perspective, the room for maneuver is actually rather limited on both theaters, right? I'm not a Syria expert, but I can already say that France is going to be the first topic that Paris will try to discuss with Clinton. You also recently, the UN report on chemical weapons and so on, and the recent tensions. On Ukraine, a potential point of contention that might emerge will be delivering arms to Ukraine, which seemed to have been in Clinton's program. Whether she's going to do it, I don't know. But what I can see is that it might be difficult to sell to Paris and especially to Berlin. What was interesting on Ukraine is that a reading that sometimes is done, maybe not in the French diplomacy, but at least among analysts, is that President Obama didn't really come necessarily with the view to make the transatlantic relations better in its priorities, but by not wanting to add up additional problems in Europe, it actually worked quite closely with the Europeans and preserved transatlantic unity. And I think Ukraine is quite a clear case where this unity was actually working together. Whether it's going to be changing after the change of administration, again, I'd be interested to hear insights from American colleagues, but I guess this unity might not be just thrown out of the window when January is just coming.
We're going to go to Mike Holmes and one of you also will make a comment. Mike, and then we'll go to group these. It's two of them, and then we'll
Thanks, Ed. I'm Mike Holsel from CTR. Always hate to be right after David because he said exactly what I was going to say about Ukraine and Hillary. I think that I don't think that her beliefs on how to react to Russia are tactical. I don't think it had much to do with the campaign. I think it had to do with her experience as Secretary of State. I think they're deeply held beliefs. They are more forward-leaning than President Obama's, and I think that if she's president, there could well be rubs with several European countries. Of course, the variable is Vladimir Putin, depending on what he does. Fed, my good friend, I just don't agree with you that a Trump presidency would somehow galvanize the Europeans to cooperate with each other. I don't.
Not galvanize, force.
Well, it's not going to force the Walloon farmers to all of a sudden decide to be cooperative. And as Bill said, it's not going to force the people who are sort of inclined to be compliant vis-a-vis Russia to all of a sudden be different. In fact, it'll probably drive them even further in that direction. Not all countries. I mean, it's not just Poland. There's a whole bank of countries in the EU, in Northern Europe, that recoil at what Putin is doing. And if Trump, I think, and I certainly hope that this is all in the subjunctive. I don't think he's going to be president. But if he would be, I just think, I just don't agree with you that it would force the Europeans to come together. I think, if anything, it might, you might see them being even farther apart. Nicholas asked the key question, which I think David answered perfectly well. I mean, I think this is, it's not a collision course. It's nothing all that serious, but the fact is Hillary understands Europe quite well, and she understands Putin quite well. And unless things change, there's going to be a dynamic there that is going to be dicey. And I do think you're perfectly right. President Obama wanted to calm the waters, and he's done it. And I think he's done a great job as far as that goes. But I think there could be problems in the future with Hillary and vis-a-vis Russia and Europe.
Very astute observer of American politics.
Yeah, I've been covering this way too long. I helped George McGovern lose 49 out of 50 states, and I've been to every convention since 1968, and I ran myself in '86. Anyway, just came back from Indiana, and Trump's going to win that state. What we have here today is an academic and diplomatic group of people. There's probably nobody here for Trump. Is anybody here for Trump? But if I had to look back at an election, I would look at this. It'd be 1968, where Richard Nixon discovered the silent majority. And I think Donald Trump has discovered the silent majority, and they're not so silent. And we still have a couple weeks for the election. I wouldn't say it's over. As Yogi Berra said, it ain't over until it's over. Even if Trump loses, there's going to be a lot of anger out there. And this is mainly an election about the anger in the United States. It's a group of people that nobody here really looks at. Nobody goes out to Indiana or Iowa and talks to these people. But there's a group out there, and it's 40%. All Trump has to do is get another 6 or 7%. I interviewed Trump in the 1990s. He was a total jerk then. He's a total jerk now. He doesn't believe in anything. He's an intellectually not curious person. He's the strangest person I've seen run for president since I've been covering campaigns for the last 40-some years. But he's a symbol of what's happening in America today. You're all talking about big issues, Ukraine, France. People aren't talking about issues. They're mad. And the Republican Party brought a group of people to this town called the Tea Party, and they came here not to govern, but to stop governing. It's something unique in American history. And these people have been talking about killing Obamacare at least 100 times. And the rank and file Republicans, or this new group that Trump has found, they're mad. And it's mainly the Republican leadership. They're mad at Paul Ryan. They're mad at all these people because they're saying they're going to stop Obamacare, and they don't. And this group's going to continue to grow out there. Hillary Clinton would be losing by 20 points now if John Kasich were the nominee. Hillary's a terrible campaigner, as I point out a million times. She ran for president once. She lost an unknown senator from Illinois named Barack Obama, and she could blow it this time. I don't think she will, but she still could. Anyway, that's my view.
Thank you for sharing those perspectives. We have Ambassador Bindi, and this lady right here.
I'm not going to talk about the Balkans, although we should. I haven't heard the word or the acronym NATO mentioned once today by anybody. Well, okay, Mike. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You know, we've heard Trump talking about getting the deadbeats to pay up. So I'm looking at a bunch of deadbeats. And there are so many symbolisms involved here. There's the symbolism of the 2%. It may not matter, and in some cases countries are carrying more than their weight. I think of Latvia, the Baltics, who don't have a whole lot of money. The symbolism for Putin of NATO, and the importance of NATO to both sides of the ocean, but certainly to this town. So I'm wondering if we could look at the security implications a little of what goes wrong if the deadbeats don't pay up, or if they decide to stop being deadbeats. If Trump wins, it redefines the entire dynamic. If Trump loses, I think we can all agree that Hillary likes NATO, but there is still, as we've been talking about, the problem of an angry country. My wife and I were driving around the southern area of Virginia yesterday, and we didn't see a single Hillary sign. This is Virginia, right, which is supposed to be going blue. We saw a lot of Trump signs. So I think it's much more complicated than a simple slam dunk. But I'd like to hear the NATO angle discussed a little. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We're going to take this one initial comment, and then Federiga and Andras, among others.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree. I just did a piece, Barbara Coppell, and I did a piece not about the angry working class men who have lost a lot, but just regular Republicans. And they're educated, they have college degrees, and they're voting for Trump. So it's going to be a lot closer than people think. It's not slam dunk, even though the Times and the others think it is. That's not the case. And they're not really ideologues, they're just Republicans. That's ideological, of course. But they are there. And these are the social worker, teacher, small town banker, et cetera. They're voting for Trump. And they don't think that anything that he has said has turned them off. You know, they say, nah, well, locker room talk. But the question that I had, besides that statement, is I'm really scared about Clinton's McCarthy-type talk right now. And I think it's really very dangerous. And I'm wondering what the European press thinks about, I mean, it's a reversal. It's like the Democrats talking about how horrible Russia is, and Trump is saying, well, he's not, I don't know him, but he's okay, I'd rather negotiate. And she's pushing us in a direction, I think, that if she actually follows through, is very dangerous. And I'd like to know what the European press thinks about her recent Russia bashing.
A couple of things. First, a little disclaimer. When I talk, this is Federiga, the analyst, that talks, not what I personally believe. But I think, and this is a little bit of the problem we have, we tend to, in this debate, we tend to overlap what our wishes are with what analysis tells us. And my analysis is much harsher, I'm afraid, of what my wishes are. You know, as a person, I do contribute for foreign policy for her, but as an analyst, I am forced to say what I see in the analysis in an unbiased way. I think this is something that we should keep in mind, especially in this country, because I have a visiting chair at Appalachian State University, so I go back and forth with North Carolina all the time, and I haven't seen one single sign for Hillary, not one. We went to Pennsylvania yesterday. I haven't seen one single sign for Hillary. Go back 4 years ago, we had, or 8 years ago, all the Obama signs that were there. I am sorry, but there is not the same kind of enthusiasm and backing that she has. So we have to stop thinking that this is going to happen. We are not going to have problems, because there is a real risk that Trump's make it. If she makes it, it's because her campaign is far more technical. So they keep in mind the electoral colleges rather than the votes in general. But the votes in general, we are there. What my colleagues at Appalachian State University tell me is that the data show that there is, and this resonates with some of you said, that there is a racial resentment across the country, which is widespread. I mean, there have been so many changes during these last 8 years, which I, as a person, I'm very fond of, and this town tends to be very fond of. But the rest of the country appears to have had little bit of short breath with that. They still have to cope with it. So this is very dangerous. I think we should keep it in mind. Going to NATO, it's assuming that Hillary wins. It's going to be interesting to see what she's going to do. Is she going to be Clinton-like kind of policy or Obama kind of policy? Because if you go back to the Bill's years, which are sort of remembered as the golden years of transatlantic relations, they were as such in the narrative. But if you look at facts, the Clinton presidency was very divisive for Europe, and in particular, it played NATO against the European Union. Think of the Maastricht Treaty. So it's going to be interesting to see whether she's going to do that or not. And Mike, when I say the Europeans are going to be forced to collaborate, I mean, the only one positive thing I could find, and is only one in the eventual Trump presidency, is that the king will be naked. The Europeans won't have the back of the Americans for the good and for the bad. Because the American administration has been, a very good presence from many points of view, but also a very negative presence from other points of view for Europe. So for once, the Europeans will be alone and will have to decide what they want to do. I mean, they won't be thrilled, but this is the only one. They might be pushed to work together because with the Trump presidency, God knows what will come. So they will have to work together one way or the other, which are not really doing now.
I'm glad Americans have baseball, because otherwise great sayings like "it ain't over till it's over" would not have been invented. But I happen to agree with this. And the Senate have been telling European leaders, you don't have a plan B. Don't get carried away. You need a plan B, because everything Fed has been talking about, Bob has been talking about, the other Bob has been talking about, and you have been talking, it's out there. And I have no idea what people will be doing on the 8th. And I think what really shows how smart Hillary is that she knows. She is really worried. She is scared to death. And that's good, because that might make her a winner. But the bottom line is the anger that has been driving this is out there. Now, why is this important for Europeans? It's important for Europeans because suddenly I see a glimmer of hope, because Europeans are starting to understand whatever happens in America will happen in Europe. And so just watch, just be very, very careful, and watch how America handles this, because it is a crisis of our democratic societies. How will America handle this? This is an important clue to Europeans. So this is one thing. The second thing about, I would say that I think Hillary is dead right about Putin. Putin and Russia are disruptive. Putin's only goal is to divide Europe, and America, and it's dangerous. And all this nice talk about, well, we have to talk to them and open, leave the communication channels open. It is so important. It is so good that we have the NATO, Russia, whatever it is called. I established it. I don't remember. The council, yeah. I was there. It is so important. Let's talk to them because, about what? About telling them, yeah, we get it. You want to destroy democratic societies. You are pushing radicalism in Europe. You are breaking down democracies in Eastern Europe. You are corrupting classes, not just 1, 2, 3 people. You are corrupting whole elites in Central Europe. That's what Putin is about. So if Putin understands only one language, and that's the language of the baseball bat, and that is what I expect from Hillary Clinton, and if Trump is elected. That is why a week after this wonderful, I don't want to say word. A week later, Trump will do the same, because it's in America's interest to make it very, very clear what we stand for and what you stand for. So I just wanted to, finally on NATO, I think it is very important to understand the reason why this 2% and why Europeans are not paying their dues is raised in this election. It's not because the smart guys in the White House or the Trump campaign have been talking about it. It's because this is what people, the electorate, are starting to talk about. They're saying the Europeans, our allies, are not paying their dues. We would love to fix the water pipes, the clean water. We would love to have European-style healthcare. We would want to fix our social welfare system like the Europeans. But guess what? We're paying a lot more than you do for your own defense. You better get ready to take this 2% seriously, and it's not about the 2%, it's about taking your defense seriously, your contribution to NATO seriously, taking your backyard seriously, taking Aleppo seriously, Europeans. Damn it, why didn't you do something about Aleppo? Why do you expect me to do something about Aleppo? So that you take all this together, and the Europeans would better wake up. On the 9th, they should sit down and, okay, hey, we get it. Because otherwise, this is going to be a very, very, very problematic next 4 years.
Thank you. I'm not expecting the sound to come on. I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message. Just joking quickly, as we're rapidly coming to a close, but on this important point, the silent majority and the comments that that provoked there on the Eacho piece. The voting patterns in Austria, where the far-right candidate hopefully almost won, the voting patterns in Austria closely resemble those visible on our side of the Atlantic. Polls commissioned by Austria's public broadcaster show that hopefully, like Trump in the primaries and in the polls, rank handily in rural areas among men and among rural women. Quickly, Martina, you might like this word, this German word that is dropped. Thus, another cross-Atlantic scenario. Opinions that were once far outside normal political discourse on immigration and nationalism are now expressed routinely. The BBC's Europe editor captured this trend by pointing to the German word salonfähig.
Salonfähig. No worries.
Which literally means passable for your living, i.e. socially acceptable. So let's take our final round of comments and questions. This gentleman is there anyone else here? We have this gentleman who wanted to kindly, and then we'll take a final round of comments from our
my name is Roger Cochetti. I work with private equity in the technology sector, and I had one observation that I was hoping I could get some reaction to, and that is I don't really think that the issue we've been discussing is Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, in the sense that Donald Trump is a real estate wheeler dealer who cultivated an image of a playboy and then went on to reality television, and what would you expect from somebody like that? But if you drew a Venn diagram of the foreign policy positions of Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, Gary Johnson, and Jill Stein, you would find that the intersection of their foreign policies for these four is that, you know, we like the Europeans, they're nice, they're our friends, they kind of look like us, they act like us, but we can't afford to defend them anymore. Goodbye. I mean, that's essentially, obviously I'm characterizing it, but in different ways, each of the four candidates said that there's a limit to America's commitment, financial commitment to the defense of Western Europe. This is obviously in stark contrast to the position that we will pay any price, bear any burden, meet any challenge to defend, essentially defend Europe. And that sentiment is not going to go away when Donald Trump loses. And every politician in the country, regardless of the fact that the American foreign policy elite is 100% unified against that, and the national security community is 90% unified against that, the public sentiment is broad, and not just Donald Trump. So somehow this is going to come to the surface because politicians do what politicians do. So I just was wondering if there was a reaction, not to Donald Trump or his antics or what clumsy statement he made most recently, but rather the underlying sentiment. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Please, any final comments? No. And then,
So,
Federiga and then-
there's no question, the folks who've mentioned that this might be closer than we think, that could very well happen. The reason you see, of course, more Trump signs when you drive through the countryside is you're in the countryside. You're in the rural areas where he has a lot of support. That said, the key to this election, who wins, is going to be about turnout. And so the worst position for Hillary to be in is where she is right now, with polls coming out saying that she has as much of a 12-point lead. All that says is to so many people who might have turned out to vote for her that, gee, I don't need to, I can stay home because I don't really like her that much anyway. You know, that she doesn't have the level of enthusiasm that will drive people to the polls. So her biggest risk factor is people stay home. That's what happened with Brexit. The polls all said that Brexit would lose, but you know, the young people all stayed home even though their future was at stake, and Brexit won. So in this particular election, it's about turnout. The one thing that she is doing well right now is pushing early voting in the states that allow it. People are coming out to vote early and not taking any chances. So that bodes well for her. We shall see. That said, on this issue, regardless of who wins, if Mr. Trump were to be successful, foreign policy is not at the top of what's driving these elections. Most Americans think that the United States spends 25% of its budget on foreign aid. You know, we spend 1%, and they don't get it. So, yes, it's a money issue, no question. We should be spending our money at home, not abroad. There's that general philosophy. But at the end of the day, that's not what's driving the Trump support, and that may not be where Trump ends up at the end of the day. He may decide, you know, okay, now that I've seen the intelligence, maybe I'll be a little bit tougher towards Putin. Who knows? It's just a wild card. We don't know where he's going to end up. I do think it's interesting that he fired Paul Manafort 2 days after his first intelligence briefing. So think about that. He had a day to think about it, what they told him, and then he fired Paul Manafort the next day. So once they told him, hey, you've got a Russian agent working as your campaign manager, you know, effectively a Russian agent, what we would call a perhaps unknowing Russian agent, he fired him. So who knows where he'll end up. That said, at the end of the day, I'm still crossing my fingers and hoping for a Hillary victory, but I think getting out the vote is the most important thing.
Thank you. I know Todd would like to say, Martina also would like to read and Andras. So, ladies first, we will go to Martina, please.
I'm going back to two statements that I heard that were about the press, and obviously, since I'm one of the press people, I can't let that go unnoticed, because you said, well, no one in this room talks to the Trump people. I can say for me and my colleagues, and I assume I can say that for Lenka as well, we've spent hours and hours and hours at the tables of people where Fox and Friends was in the backdrop and where we learned why Donald Trump is the only alternative for the United States. We've learned why people argue this way. It's not what we talked about today because the question above this panel was a different one, but it is exactly what our daily work for more than a year is right now, to explain to people who are flabbergasted why the United States think what they're thinking and why there are so many people actually following him. And so we've been there, we've talked with them, we've been through county of county of county, I would say, without even having talked to Lenka about where she's been before, where you only see Trump signs, where you see Democrats who are registered Democrats and now are registered Republicans because of Donald Trump. We've talked to all of those people. And it is exactly what we're filing back home because of the fascination that I initially said is there. We are filing so much about this and trying to explain this back home to try to make people understand why is politics going the way it is going. And probably waking up on November 9th, we all do not say Hillary Clinton's winning, because I was in Las Vegas for the last debate, and obviously every single question from every single station afterwards, and it was dozens, was, so that's going to be it, right? Hillary's going to win. That was the assumption from Germany. But I think all of us journalists have learned the lesson the easier or the harder way through this election, that we're not predicting that anymore. We're saying, well, if you take the reasoning that you usually take, this is what we probably would say. But the unexpected is to be expected at this election, and that's something that we're actually reporting back. It's nothing where we're like saying this is what it's going to be. So rest assured, we're trying to differentiate. As journalists, we're not only bad people. We're one-sided. No, but it's something that is, and I have to say, and you probably can't say that very loud, but it is a fascinating time as a journalist to be observing this. This is not saying positive or negative. It is just interesting, because things happen that if you told me they would happen, like I was in this country reporting when Obama was elected in 2008. So I saw the movement there. If you would have told me 8 years ago that there was a movement, totally different, but that there was such a huge movement 8 years later, I would have said, no way. There's no way. And it is, as we all know, a totally different movement and totally different motivation and totally different people. But I would have never thought that this would happen. And when I was sent out to D.C., they said, oh, so it's going to be Clinton versus Bush. That was the expectation in Germany. They thought the royalties would run against each other. But we're doing our job explaining over and over and over again, trying to explain why this country is in the situation and in the opinion and the state of mind that it's in right now.
Thank you, Martina. Martina summarized everything, more or less, what I wanted to say, but also further to maybe your comments, I think why the issue is so important to people in Europe, but maybe even especially in Central Europe. I think the societies just see that it echoes what is happening there as well. And the arguments just mirror themselves, be it discussion on migration, be it a discussion on economy, be it a discussion on globalization, for example, which is frankly surprising, even for some people when I tell them, listen to the speeches, listen to what I tell you about what people, or listen to the voices of the people who I interview. They say exactly the same thing as you do. So where do you see yourself the origins for this discussion and for the level of the discussion in your own country, in the Czech Republic, respectively, Poland, Hungary, and all the other countries? The other interesting point, definitely for me, without any pluses or minuses, as a former correspondent in Russia and being here in the US, covering the US for the first time in my life, just the fact that Russia is the third person in the room during the elections, like look how much time we spent talking about Russia. That is fascinating, but it's also very logical, and it's not in a way surprising at all after being in Russia for 5 years, then coming here, seeing how much Russia invested in meddling more or less in the European processes. Little things, here money for this party, there money for this oligarch who's going to finance elections of a president of a certain country. Suddenly we see that there is a suspicion that it might be happening over here. Of course, we don't have the proofs. We have only the talk about the 17 agencies which confirm the possibility that Russia is involved in hacking attacks and etc. But just the fact that there is a country who is obviously trying to disrupt the whole transatlantic connection and who is succeeding in a way, even in the discussion how it's consumed and which way it is oriented, that I think should be something of a real concern for Europeans and for the Americans too.
Thank you. We'll go right back in order. Here's Todd, and then I'm rushing over to Amos. If you're good, then Andras, you'll have the last word. So let's proceed right now.
Yeah, I hate to end on such a pessimistic note, but for 20 years I've been reading about the decline of U.S.-European relations and the decline of the transatlantic relationship, and I really have not believed it. We were the generation that grew up with, after World War II, the Marshall Plan, the NATO. I think it's a whole new ballgame now, and I think there are several factors simultaneously that are threatening the transatlantic relationship. The EU going backward, in fact. And we haven't talked too much about trade, but instead of talking about GMOs and the Wallonian cows, we should really talk about it's not so much about tariffs, it's about standards, and who is going to set the global standards in technology, in all these areas, in communications. And if we don't do it with the Europeans, the Chinese will. And we're not talking about that. And I'm very concerned that the EU-Canada agreement has been suspended, and both candidates are anti-TPA. That's very concerning to me, and that really goes to the heart of the transatlantic relationship now. And then NATO, people think about NATO. We grew up in a time when NATO was the bulwark against the Soviet Union, and now they think about it in terms of, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, very unpopular wars. So we need to make a new case for NATO. And then finally, and then I'll conclude, but in the United States, the demographics are completely changing. We grew up in a world where most people were of European origin, and now the new generation, they don't care, they could care less about Europe. They are Hispanic, Asian, and it's going to be, and I think even if Hillary Clinton wins, she's going to face a very tough case to make the case for trade, to make the case for NATO, because of the demographics and the huge Trump. We can't underestimate the Trump, has been said in the audience. I completely agree. We can't underestimate those forces in our society.
Thank you. Related to the two questions, first NATO. I agree. I mean, we keep hearing about the 2%, but we know that it's much more than that. I mean, in Europe, we produce more different kind of boats than the US does, right? While two armies are not comparable in terms of capacities and size, right? There's as many soldiers under the flag in Europe than it is in the US. Europe, again, is first about interoperability, harmonizing armament contracts, and then secondly, what Andras mentioned, just the willingness to step up to the plate and actually use force when we need. And I cannot help, although I'm not representing the French diplomacy, to mention to Andras that one country was actually at some point more or less ready to go on Syria in August 2013, that it's something that stays when you talk to French diplomats. This Obama-Hollande call of August 2013, it's something that very much stays, right? And on Aleppo, again, one country also has been trying to bring the perpetrators of those crimes in front of the International Criminal Court, but it's not going to go too far because some countries, including Russia or the US, are not recognizing this International Criminal Court. On Russia, I cannot but share Lenka's surprise. I mean, I lived in countries where I was expecting to hear about Russia, in Tallinn, in Prague, or in Helsinki, where I just was. But watching the two debates, I was really amazed about, I mean, even if it's Wallace's dream, I think Putin did not have hoped to be mentioned so often, I think, in a presidential debate. And so why is that? I think, I don't really agree that Putin wakes up every morning and says, I want to divide Europe and undermine democracy. Putin wakes up and says, I want to stay in power in Russia. So the playing on European division is something which is more a means to an end. It's a strategy. So we have to think about it as a strategy. And so how to respond to it? First of all, we have to be clear about our assessment. We shouldn't paint it like 6 feet tall, because then we will take the wrong actually answer against it. If we essentialize, if we don't actually look clearly at what's happening, we might take the wrong answer. And the second point is that I talked about populism earlier. In a way, sometimes what Russia does under the current government is populism at the level of foreign policy. And in the sense of using the West's contradictions to its own benefits, exactly like populists in countries used elites' contradiction to their own benefits. How do you counter that? You don't counter that by being even more binary, even more black and white. You counter that by solving your own problems, by looking at your own contradictions, by not blaming the Front National or other populist parties just on Russia, right? It's European creations. They're using it, but we shouldn't shy away from looking at our responsibilities. And Madam, to your question, I totally agree with Mike that the next discussion between also Europe and US will be about Russia. So we better have this discussion now and try to anticipate how to actually work around it. But what we saw, I don't know if you saw, but Putin canceled his visit to Paris 2 weeks ago. And right away, the opposition picked up on that and said, look how weak Hollande is. He's not even respected, and so on and so on. And there's a direct link, and there's a direct fear in France that some of the members of the opposition might actually use a more hawkish Clinton administration rhetoric on Russia to undermine further European support for sanctions. I think we are at a time where everyone is actually more or less coming together. But the fact is that in Europe, in France, often the most pro-Russians are also the most anti-Americans. It's kind of surprising, but so those who criticize the sanction regime accuse, wrongly in my view, the US of pouring oil on the fire about Ukraine, right? But if precisely a different kind of rhetoric might empower those people, just as delivering weapons in a certain way to Ukraine might lead the Minsk argument, while not doing very well already, to collapse, and then potentially even the sanction regime to collapse. So again, I think we have to balance those two aspects.
No, first of all, thank you for an excellent debate. That was really interesting for people sitting here as well, I think. And three things about Russia. We mentioned the hacking. You know, I remember 2 years ago I was part of a campaign of the former Italian foreign minister for becoming NATO Secretary General. And one of the things he pushed was that the next problem would be cyber attacks. And people didn't believe it. They simply laughed in their face. And here we are. But that being said, I think sometimes we also have to understand the unintended consequences of what we say and what we write. Because, all right, building all these things that, the Russians are hacking into our electoral system, do you see the damage that this is bringing? I mean, the most powerful country in the world, the mother of all democracies, the system is so weak that it's being attacked by Russian hackers. I think the damage of this narrative is way beyond the possible benefits of that are coming from. And I'm baffled that the Clinton campaign doesn't see this. This is a huge sign of weakness from the United States of America. And I think I would hope they would reflect more on what are the consequences. Another thing about Russia. There is a problem in the foreign policy and the way our students as well study foreign policy. History matters from some parts of the world. And this is especially for Europe. I mean, whether we like it or not, Russia perceives itself as an empire, a superpower, and wants to be acknowledged as such. And the more we poke into Putin from some points of view, the more he's going to become aggressive. And the other question we have to ask ourselves, can we really deal in this uncertain world without Russia? I mean, we don't like him. I get it. It's not, the Russians are tough to negotiate with, very tough to negotiate with. That's a fact. It's a very imperfect democracy. True, but some of our best allies, even part of NATO, are by now far imperfect democracies than we are. And what he said about the decline of democracy is something that really worries me today, So, fine. And haven't we learned enough that toppling countries' leadership only brings damage, only brings trouble? We're not in the position of toppling the Russian leadership, because that would bring far more damage than than of the good it would bring. And I think this has to be kept into mind.
Thank you very much. Croatia's neighbor, Serbia, the United States had a hand in helping out the dictator, and I think it's been positive. So,
I don't know how many of you play in rock bands. I know Todd does, and I do, and I know the worst part is when the audience starts to thin out, and you think they want an encore, and they want to go. This is the moment when you all want to go. You don't want to listen to more comments. Let me just say two things. We'll fight this out, because I have a totally different view on Russia. Just yesterday, we remembered the 60th anniversary of the 1956 invasion by the Russians, the crushing of the possibility of Hungary becoming a Western country. And that's the Russia I know. That's the Russia that has determined my thinking. And trust me, it's still there. So, but let me say this. Let me say this. I think we're circling around one big issue. How is the West going to deal with the issues that created the Trump phenomenon? Because Trump is not about Trump. Trump is the wrong response to the right questions about our democracies, our market economies, about wealth distribution, about social welfare, etc., etc. And here's something that I hope that our American friends are going to think about, is what happens 4 years from now. You'll get a smoother, nicer, better-mannered person who shows up. It's just like the French phenomenon. You had the old Le Pen was not very nice. The new Le Pen is very smooth, nice, well-talking, very sympathetic to many. And what happens from 4 years from now? The reason I say this is because I think the reason why the Europeans need to be worried about Hillary Clinton not being able to spend enough time on Europe is because Hillary's first and foremost problem will be to deal with this. And if she's smart, as I think she is, this is what she will be working on from day one. And so this is what the Europeans need to think about. And to conclude, I know you want to shoot me now. The final, okay, that's good. I just want to say, for once, the Europeans should be the ones who really work a little harder to keep this alliance, to keep the transatlantic relations going. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Amos is going to bring us to a Churchillian close, and then I will ask all of you, I'll say a word in thanks to our excellent.
I don't have to say anything. I just did it for the
questions.
Okay, so I'm going to, so just to finish off on two levels. Panel, incredible, and thank you for arranging this, and Ambassador. An incredible discussion of such high level. The number one concern about among the British about the US right now is, are they going to have a US football team in the UK? Okay? Think about this, and I would argue that everybody has said the same thing. What has made Trump here is the angry individual in the countryside. In England, I would argue in France, I would argue in every country, there's a disparate conversation. The strategic thinkers of this room versus the people who want an American football team. Right? B, do we even get that far to the question? So let me throw something else. The question is the 3 o'clock call. Here's the 3 o'clock call. Putin, maybe he comes across the border. He's an old KGB guy. I don't think he'd be that blunt. What happens, which I think may more likely to happen, when China starts drilling for oil in the South China Sea? And the Philippines and Duterte says, I'm going to send out my gunboats, and more importantly, the Vietnamese send out their planes. And the call comes in at 3 a.m. Do we even get to talk about the next level in Europe? Because what happens in that South China Sea is going to affect everybody and every conversation. I think our problems might be a bit more real, because there was almost a shooting war 2 years ago between the Vietnamese and Chinese. It's going to happen soon, and then what happens? So, football, Chinese, what a great room this has been today. Great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amos, thank you so much. Amos, thank you. And before I thank our esteemed panelists, again, Ambassador Hara, thank you to the Embassy. I want to convey as well special thanks to Ivana Heimo for outstanding support, to Heidi Obermeyer with SAIS, Center for Transatlantic Relations, and of course to our own Cooper Yu, who's there manning the camera and doing so many other things to help make this a possibility. Very much thanks to them. Let me state for the record here, it's important, of course, that this is non-political, non-partisan activity. This is just an analytical discussion. However, remarks we have a period of times, this is completely non-partisan without interference in the U.S. election. And my thanks, Amos, Andras, Martina, Lenka, Bill, Ben, David, and Tom. Thank you all. No one, and thank you as well. Virtually not a soul has left. Thank you all.